Hi, thanks for joining me today. This is Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. I came across a book some time ago. It was sitting on my shelf. It's not a brand new book. It came out, let me check it out, 2004. It's not very long. It's maybe 150 pages or so. It's called Can a Smart Person Believe in God? So I just recently read it, and I enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it. The author is Michael Guillen, Guillen. He's a former ABC News science correspondent, so he's been on television a lot, theoretical physicist, and he wrote a book called Five Equations That Changed the World. And I've seen that book, I haven't read it, but you can tell from the title, he's going to argue that a smart person can believe in God. I want to take you to chapter 3. He's got a lot of good chapters, and I'm certainly going to come back to this in future podcasts. But chapter 3 is called What's the Problem? And you can tell what's going on when he has two quotes that start the chapter, one from Clarence Darrow. I don't believe in God because I don't believe in Mother Goose. Voltaire said, to believe in God is impossible. Not to believe in him is absurd. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, so you can see where we're going here. He said he thinks atheists have turned their backs on God for all the wrong reasons. Isn't that interesting? He said he's talked to former atheists that have confessed that actually they did believe in God, but they were rebellious or resentful or arrogant or scarred by some kind of childhood experiences. So he wants to talk about these things like, is Christianity a superstition? And he mentions an atheist, Michael Shermer, who reflects about how we've always been superstitious. So he said, yeah, all of us are. He said, we sneeze and people say, bless you. They said even scientists are not above being superstitious. He gives an example, Johannes Kepler. He did a lot to discover the orbits of planets and things like that. They practiced astrology, right, alongside astronomy. Isaac Newton. This brilliant Isaac Newton, and he was practicing alchemy. So I think that's interesting. But he said, are the atheists right? Is believing in God itself a superstition? Is it kind of like tossing a coin in a wishing well, or you throw salt over your shoulder? He says, are God and the devil just the mothers of all lucky charms, good and bad? He said, well, here's the problem. He said, atheists who believe so aren't familiar with human history. He said, religion has often been the civilized world's principal agent against superstition that's trying to take people from gullibility and ignorance to a more sophisticated life. He says these atheists that talk about, the superstitious faith, he said they must be unfamiliar with the Bible, because they said they should know that the God of the book himself, the Bible, he's opposed to superstition. Now he gives some examples. I don't know if I'll read all of them, but Leviticus 19:26, don't practice divination or sorcery. Deuteronomy 18:10 through 12, let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, etc., etc. So there's warning there all over the place. Isaiah 2:6 and 8 talks about people being full of superstitions and practicing divination. So kind of sad. He said, I'm back to the author again now. He says there was a Gallup poll that said more than a quarter of today's Americans believe in witches and astrology, and a third believe in ghosts. But he says, please, please, don't lump those beliefs in with our belief in God, as some atheists do. He said, to God, superstitions are a sin. That's an affront to him. So he says, well, some people say, why do we have God if it's a superstition? Why is that hanging around? We've got a highly intellectual climate. What's going on? Why can't we shake ourselves from this superstition? So he uses Richard Dawkins, of course, everybody's favorite atheist. He uses him as an example of at least an answer an atheist would give. He's got a book called A Devil's Chaplain. And he said humanity's belief in God is somewhat like a virus. It just persists generation after generation because you get religious parents that infect the minds of their offspring. But I like this. The author says, I've got 3 problems with this disease idea that we keep infecting our kids. He said, yeah, first, it is true. Most of us parents do put charming fantasies in the heads of our kids, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, Tooth Fairy. But he said somewhere on the way to adulthood, most kids discover the truth, either talking to their friends or just figuring it out on their own, and then they eventually walk away from that. So he says what Dawkins' theory doesn't answer with any persuasion is this. If God is just another fictional character drummed into the young, why is he the only one that escapes being thoroughly discredited? Why doesn't our belief in God go the way of our belief in Santa and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy? Okay, he's got a second problem with this infection idea. He said it does appear as if most of us do perpetuate our parents' beliefs. Okay. But he said if you look at our religious proclivities, it's way more complex than Dawkins paints. He says 7 in 10 Americans say their faith has changed. It came about through thought and discussion. This is a finding, a Gallup finding again, and as a result of a strong emotional experience. So it's a thoughtful, deliberate approach to God. So that's what's going on here. It's not mindlessly replicating our parents. People have thought about their belief system. Here's his third problem with Dawkins' theory, that it's a problem with infecting. It's a contagious disease, and the parents are giving it to their kids. He said it fails to explain how and why this God virus is able to survive in hostile climates. Now, here in America, okay, no problem. But what about modern China? He said up until the 80s, he said the Communist Party officials tried almost anything they could think of to destroy religion, to indoctrinate Chinese kids to think that religion and God were just contemptible and dangerous superstitions. Their battle cry was triumph over ignorance with science. So if Dawkins was right, then that atheism bug should have infected all of China. But he says the opposite is happening. Atheism in the country is weakening, and spirituality is strengthening. I'd heard that somewhere else, too, that there are millions of believers in China. So he said after all these decades of the communist Chinese trying to shame and suppress and outright kill traditional religion, it's on the rise. And it's not just their traditional religions like Buddhism and Taoism, but Christianity as well. Here's a professor of international relations at the University of Pennsylvania. He says Christianity today is more vigorous than at the height of Jesuit influence in the 17th century. So we've got a rise in religion. So he said communist intellectuals themselves are no longer accusing religion of being dangerous. Instead, they're finding that in universities all over China, there's new interest in God. They have scholarly journals that are being respectful in their study of religion. They're multiplying. So God's reality, his reality, not some kind of hypothetical virus, is the most clear-cut explanation for long after our abandoning Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy, we keep believing in him. So why, despite all these efforts of these atheists, that's kind of interesting, isn't it, that God endures despite all these efforts. Well, in the next section of this chapter, he says, belief in God, why do people believe in God? Well, if you don't buy into the theory of Dawkins about the parents and giving their kids this contagious disease, he said maybe it's like somebody else said maybe it's like a Valium tablet. It's a protective illusion. It's about survival of the fittest. It's a comforting fiction. We maybe believe in God to delude ourselves into thinking that we're significant and life has meaning and everything's going to be okay. So he takes that on as well. He said, are we dupes for believing in God? Poor, self-deluded weaklings. We don't have the smarts to deal with the truth of our pointless existence. He said, well, wait a minute. He said, they keep talking about the comfort of religion, the comfort. And he says, wait a minute. Comfort of religion? He says, here comes the main flaw about the atheist saying, oh, God is a comforting delusion. He said, anyone who worships God knows that he's not comforting. He's not a big teddy bear up in the sky. Now, the author says, yes, God does comfort us in times of need, but look what else he does. He needles us. He reproves us. Sometimes it says he scares us silly. Just ask Moses. Ask Job. Ask Jesus himself, he says. At critical times in their lives, they found themselves feeling anything but comforted on account of their devotion to God. He says, comfort of religion? Tell that to Peter. He was crucified upside down. Comfort of religion? He says, tell that to Mother Teresa. She went all over India, into the gutters, picking up patients dying. Says, comfort of religion? Tell that to the large number of Christians worldwide who are martyred because of their belief. In fact, he has some statistics here. I'd never heard this. Apparently, according to the World Christian Encyclopedia, something like 165,000 Christians every year are martyred. Just think about 165,000. I live in a city that's probably around 160,000, and I think about everybody in that city being killed off every year that happens. That's amazing. There was a study by the International Religious Freedom Act that was enacted by the Congress, the U.S. Congress in 1998. It says an even greater number of people, possibly 1/2 of the world's population, suffer non-fatally for their faith. It might be state-sponsored slander, confiscation of their property, surveillance of their police, torture, beatings, forced marriage, rape, on and on. Really? That's comfort of religion? The author says, sometimes I do wish God was just a figment of my imagination. Then I could order him around. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah. He says, comfort my religion? Well, yeah. But he said, his former pastor once put it this way: if our minds were truly in the business of creating God, there's no way they'd invent Christianity. Isn't that true? I mean, God tells us to pick up our cross and follow Jesus. That doesn't sound comforting. God says our behavior is terrible and we're rebels and we've got to lay down our arms. Nobody wants to hear that. God tells us in the Bible, I will have to reach out and save you. You can't do it on your own. That's not very comforting. That's no comfort. That says that we're weak, that we don't have the strength to get to heaven ourselves. All right. Then he's got another section here. He calls it a deplorable source of evil. Here's another complaint about Christianity and religion. This says atheists say that religion is evil and bloodthirsty. We've heard that over and over again. So he has a few quotes here. Bertrand Russell: I regard religion as a disease born of fear and as a source of untold misery to the human race. Here's what Joseph Conrad, a famous author, said: Christianity has brought an infinity of anguish to innumerable souls on this earth. Wow. So he said, I like this because he's fair. He says, we do have a woeful history of committing all sorts of violence in the name of our religious beliefs. I mean, think about that. Pagans sacrificed children. Jews persecuted Christians. Christians persecuted Jews. Islamic fundamentalists attacked innocent Americans. But he said, those things are terrible. But he said, often this evil was not the main motivating factor. The true reasons, he said, have been fear and ignorance and hatred and greed and jealousy, things that God condemns. God doesn't appreciate and doesn't approve of this horrible stuff that goes on. He condemns it himself. He calls us to separate right from wrong, the author says. And he said, remember, what's in there in the top 10? He calls it, thou shalt not murder. He said, but we have this rebellious nature, and we keep sabotaging our ability to behave accordingly. Yeah. He says, the gloomy reality is that we commit atrocities in the name of just about everything. So it's more than religion. He said scientific knowledge, medical treatments, political utopias. And he gives some examples. So I think this is interesting. Yes, Christians and others have done some terrible things. But look at the rest of the world, too. Joseph Mengele, what did he do? Experimented on twin children. The U.S. military had syphilis studies on African-American men that weren't aware of it. Scientists have done radiation studies on mentally challenged children. CIA sponsored tests of LSD on unsuspecting prisoners. What did Stalin do? He slaughtered millions who opposed Soviet communism. So he said, God has it down exactly right. He knows that we are evil. He knows we're broken. He knows we do terrible things. But he offers us a practical way of getting out of this, a loving relationship with him. And he said, I think that's done more to help people overcome colossal problems than psychologists, sociologists, and all sorts of scientific experts combined. So he gives a couple of examples. Chuck Colson, That was President Nixon's infamous hatchet man. And during the Watergate scandal, he converted to Christianity. He got thrown in jail, came out, founded Prison Fellowship Ministries. That's the largest organized prison ministry in the U.S. It reaches millions of inmates now, and ex-inmates and their families. And he says Colson really believed in Matthew 25:40. I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. And he said it doesn't end there as far as that prison fellowship. One of the volunteers, her name is Mary Kay Beard, she's a convicted bank robber. She was on the FBI most wanted list. Talk about turning her life around. She gave her life completely to Jesus. She joined prison fellowship. She founded something called Angel Tree. Maybe you've heard of that. It's so neat. It ministers to children of inmates and ex-inmates. They're trying to break the cycle of crime within families. So I thought that was so cool. What did she say? Angel Tree was not my project. It wasn't even my idea. It was God's idea. He just allowed me to be the instrument he used to plant the seed. That's great. He goes on as he begins to wrap up the chapter. He said, you know, the people that complain about evil because of religion, he said, it's pretty ironic when we look at the violence that Marxism, Stalinism, and other godless political regimes of the 20th century have done. China, something like 65 million people were killed. Russia, 20 million. North Korea and Cambodia, about 2 million each. All sorts of things. You know, he says it's true. They didn't kill in the name of just their atheism. They killed in the name of their godless political philosophies. But he said, let's not mince words. Atheism was a fundamental part of their creed. Exactly right. They felt that they had no God out there to answer to, so the state was the most powerful thing, and you had to knock people around to get them in shape there. He says, generally speaking, these communist governments denounced religion, and they targeted churches and temples and priests and ministers and rabbi. So he said these acts of savage violence committed by godless individuals make liars of atheists who accuse God and religion of being the main sources of bloodshed. Not true. Main sources of bloodshed have come from atheistic individuals and atheistic political regimes. He said, is religion a backward superstition? Is it a comforting delusion? He said, the only backward superstition he thinks of is the belief that atheists are somehow smarter than people who believe in God. That's a good way to end the chapter. So I think you might like this book. It's easy to read. Can a smart person believe in God? And the answer is yes. So he gives some, it's a slightly different angle than what you might encounter in some other apologetics books. So it's probably available. It's been around a while, so I bet you could find some cheap copies. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that, and let's do another podcast soon. Thanks. Take care.